Some deaths aren't accidents. They're the result of ignoring warnings and making choices that never needed to be made. In this video, we look at the most shocking cases where simple stupidity turned fatal. It was January 14th, 2022, in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. The afternoon was gray and quiet, with cold air moving across the shoreline. Snow covered the grass near the path. A public dock extended into the water. The lake surface appeared frozen from shore, with pale ice stretching outward under flat winter light. Melissa Harding, 34 years old, worked as a retail store manager and had driven to the lake with two friends after lunch. The visit was casual. They planned to walk, take photos, and leave before sunset. Melissa mentioned wanting a short video of the lake for her social media page. The lake had frozen unevenly after several cold nights. Near the shoreline and dock, water movement from currents and runoff slowed ice formation. Posted signs warned that ice thickness had not been checked and that skating was unsafe. From a distance, the surface looked solid, but darker patches near the dock showed thinner ice. No safety gear was present. The recording comes from Melissa's friend, who stood several yards back on the rocks with a phone held vertically. The camera remains steady. Melissa steps off the rocks and onto the ice near the edge, holding her own phone at chest height, aimed outward toward the lake. She takes a few careful steps, then stops to frame the shot. The person filming warns her that the ice appears unsafe. Melissa turns her head briefly toward the camera. The warning is repeated. She dismisses the concern with a short response and remains where she is. She does not step back. Instead, she faces the lake again and lifts her phone higher. She plants her feet wider apart and jumps straight down with both boots, landing hard. The ice flexes beneath her weight but does not break. She turns slightly toward the camera, holding her phone out as if to demonstrate the result. The warning is repeated. Melissa reacts immediately, dismissing the concern and continuing to stand on the ice. She jumps a second time. A sharp cracking sound is picked up by the phone microphone. Thin fractures spread quickly beneath her boots. Dark streaks appear as water pushes up through the cracks. Melissa remains where she is. She looks down briefly, then bends her knees and jumps again, harder than before. This time, the ice fails immediately. The surface collapses into an irregular opening several feet wide. Melissa drops straight down. Her phone disappears with her. Her arms come up as she tries to grab the ice edge. The water beneath is dark and moving, forcing broken slabs inward. The camera jolts sharply. Melissa's head and shoulders surface briefly. She presses her forearms onto the ice, but the edge bends and snaps. The opening widens as pieces rotate and sink. Her hands slip off the wet surface. Melissa's head goes under again. Air bubbles rise through the opening. The ice continues to fracture around the hole, breaking into smaller plates. The person filming starts moving. The image shakes violently as footsteps crunch on snow and rock. The camera angle tilts down toward the opening, then swings away. Melissa's friend drops the phone and runs toward the edge, attempting to reach her, but stops when the ice begins to crack. Another bystander shouts for help and calls 911. Emergency services are dispatched within minutes. Police and fire units arrive with ice rescue boards and ropes. Because the ice near the collapse is unstable, responders approach from a safer point along the shoreline. Divers enter the water after additional units arrive. Melissa is located beneath the ice and brought to shore roughly 15 minutes after the fall. Resuscitation efforts are attempted but unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determines the cause of death as drowning due to cold water immersion. The water temperature and exposure time are consistent with rapid loss of strength and coordination. Authorities find no criminal wrongdoing. Barriers and winter warning signs are installed near the dock. The phone footage is collected for evidence. After ice measurements showed less than 2 inches of clear ice, authorities issued thin ice warnings and closed municipal access points near the dock for the remainder of the season. It was August 12, 2017, in Phoenix, Arizona. The evening was hot and still. Music echoed across a mid-rise apartment rooftop. Patio lights glowed. Drinks lined a folding table. Guests crowded the edge, talking over traffic noise below, while phones recorded short clips of the party in nearby buildings. One of the guests at the rooftop party that evening was Marco Villanueva, 28 years old. He worked as a line cook at a downtown restaurant and lived in the same building where the gathering took place. The party was informal, made up of friends and co-workers celebrating the weekend. Marco had finished a late shift earlier that night and joined shortly after work. A large cooler sat beside the drink table. Inside was a metal thermos containing liquid nitrogen, brought by one of the guests to create fog effects around cocktail glasses. The nitrogen was used briefly around cocktail glasses to create vapor effects and was intended to evaporate completely before any contact with drinks. No professional equipment or written safety instructions were present. Several guests filmed the fog spilling across the table. Marco watched the process and referenced prior kitchen experience with frozen desserts and rapid chilling techniques. Another guest gestures for him to wait, indicating the contents were not safe. Marco dismisses the warning and remains focused on the cup. A small paper cup was placed on the table. Someone poured a small amount of liquid nitrogen into the cup, intending to let it fully evaporate before use. The cup continued producing visible vapor. Before it stopped, Marco picked it up. A second warning gesture follows as the cup continues releasing vapor. Marco responded immediately, dismissing the concern. He raised the cup slightly, as if to demonstrate confidence, and continued without waiting. Several phones were pointed toward him. One camera was held close, framing his upper body in the cup. He lifted the cup and drank from it before the remaining liquid nitrogen had fully evaporated. Within seconds, his posture changed. He bent forward sharply and grabbed his abdomen. The camera captures him stepping back and bracing himself against the table. Some guests initially react casually, assuming the behavior is intentional. Marco shakes his head and sets the empty cup down. He tries to straighten but doubles over again. A harsh coughing sound is audible. He spits liquid onto the concrete and begins vomiting. The camera operator steps closer. Dark fluid appears mixed with the vomit. The laughter stops immediately. Marco drops to one knee and presses both hands against his stomach. His breathing becomes rapid and shallow. He attempts to stand but collapses sideways onto the concrete. The phone camera tilts downward, showing him curled on his side, no longer responding. Several guests react at once. Phones are lowered as people move toward Marco. One recording continues as he stops moving. His eyes remain open, but he does not respond to movement or touch. Emergency services are called approximately 1 minute after the collapse, and medical responders arrive about 8 minutes later. Paramedics assess Marco on the rooftop and begin treatment immediately, before transporting him by stretcher to a nearby hospital, where he is pronounced dead shortly after arrival, despite emergency care. The medical examiner determines the cause of death as severe internal and airway injuries caused by cryogenic exposure and rapid gas expansion. Liquid nitrogen boils instantly at body temperature, expanding into gas. The expansion ruptured the stomach, leading to internal bleeding and shock. The medical examiner states that the injuries were not survivable. Investigators ruled the incident accidental with no charges filed. It was March 4th, 2016, outside a small city in central Ohio. The day shift was ending. Conveyors slowed, forklifts were parked, and fluorescent lights hummed over stained concrete. In the rear bay, a trash compactor sat idle, hopper open, awaiting the final cleanup load before doors closed tonight. One of the employees still on the floor that evening was Evan Holt, 34 years old. He was a maintenance technician who had worked at the facility for nearly 6 years. Co-workers described him as someone who fixed problems quickly, often without involving supervisors. Evan had recently gone through a divorce and worried about overtime cuts. He disliked paperwork delays and preferred to handle issues himself. During end-of-shift cleanup, loose debris was being cleared from the rear bay. While working, Evan's keyring slipped from his pocket and dropped into the open hopper of the rear-loading trash compactor. The keys were visible near the edge on top of a thin layer of trash. The machine was idle, but not powered down or locked out. The control panel remained energized, and the automatic cycle system was still armed. The facility required a full lockout before anyone entered the machinery. Evan knew the procedure and had followed it before. That evening, he ignored it. Surveillance cameras above the bay recorded the next several minutes. The footage shows Evan standing at the hopper and looking inside. He pauses, glances toward the office where coworkers finish paperwork, then steps onto the steel lip. He does not signal anyone or reach for the nearby power disconnect. Instead, he climbs inside. Evan lowers himself feet first into the hopper, bracing one hand against the side wall. The keys are less than 2 feet away. He bends forward to reach them. At that moment, an indicator light switches on. The compactor activates. His movement triggers a pressure sensor and starts an automatic reset cycle. There is no audible warning. Steel rams begin closing inward. Evan reacts immediately, pushing both hands against the walls. The narrowing space prevents him from climbing out. Within seconds, the rams pin him at the torso. His legs kick briefly before stopping. The first compression cycle completes and pauses. Evan remains trapped and bent forward. The machine resets and begins a second cycle. Pressure collapses his chest and stops all movement. The cycle completes and locks. In the office, co-workers continue working unaware. Low alarms blend into background noise. Nearly 2 minutes later, someone notices Evan is missing. They rush to the bay and stop when they see him. Emergency services are called, and power is shut down. Fire and rescue arrive and remove Evan using hydraulic tools. He is pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determines that death was caused by massive crush injuries. His chest collapsed, lungs ruptured, and internal bleeding led to rapid death. The keys were later recovered undamaged, still inside the hopper. They were within arm's reach of where he first entered. The lockout switch he ignored remained untouched beside the machine. It was May 17, 2015, in Loudoun County, Virginia. Early evening traffic moved steadily across a 2-lane concrete overpass spanning a wooded drainage ravine. The sun sat low behind the trees, and the drop below, between 68 to 72 feet depending on slope, was mostly concealed by foliage and shadow. Daniel Rourke, 23, arrived alone shortly before sunset. He was a recent community college graduate working part-time at an auto parts store. Friends later described him as methodical and confident in his own calculations, often dismissive of safety standards he believed were overly cautious. He trusted measurements, ratings, and tools more than warnings. In the days leading up to that evening, Daniel had planned a solo bungee-style jump using improvised equipment. Recreational bungee jumping in the United States relied on engineered cords, redundant harnesses, trained spotters, and wide safety margins. Daniel believed those safeguards were unnecessary. Over the course of a week, he purchased several heavy-duty elastic cargo bungee cords from different stores. Each cord carried a manufacturer rating intended for securing loads, not arresting free falls. At home, he tied the cords together end-to-end using climbing knots learned online. He tested the setup by suspending sandbags in his garage and bouncing them several feet off the ground. The knots held. The cords did not snap. On flat pavement, the combined resting length measured just under 65 feet. Daniel then measured the bridge. He lowered a tape measure tied to a bolt and cross-checked the distance using a phone inclinometer and a step count along the guardrail. Notes later recovered from his car showed measurements clustered around 70 feet. Based on those figures, he believed he had sufficient clearance. What he failed to account for was dynamic elongation, how elastic systems stretch far beyond their resting length under the force of a falling body. At 7:42 p.m., Daniel positioned his phone on the inside of the guardrail, angled outward to record. He anchored one end of the cords to the steel rail using webbing and a locking carabiner. There was no helmet, no backup line, and no trained spotter. He fashioned an ankle harness from padded straps taken from a weightlifting belt. The recording shows Daniel climbing onto the outside of the guardrail. He adjusts the cords, checks the anchor point, and looks down once into the ravine. He steps forward, grips the cords briefly, then releases. The cords deploy smoothly. The knots hold. The anchor point does not shift. As Daniel accelerates downward, the elastic begins to stretch, slowly at first, then rapidly as speed increases. Under full body weight and free-fall acceleration, the total length extends far beyond the resting measurement Daniel relied on. From the camera's angle, Daniel drops out of frame. Seconds later, a sharp elastic sound is captured. Not a break, but the cords reaching extreme tension, followed immediately by a dull, hollow impact from below. Daniel strikes the sloped ground of the ravine before the system reaches maximum rebound. The cords continue stretching after impact, briefly shifting his body before gravity pulls it back down. During the rebound, his body twists violently. No movement follows. The phone continues recording as the cords vibrate in place. A passing motorist notices the cords hanging over the bridge and stops, calling 911. Emergency responders arrive and descend into the ravine on foot. Daniel is found at the base of the slope with no signs of life and is pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner determines the cause of death as severe blunt force trauma, including a cervical spine fracture. Investigators find no evidence of equipment failure. Daniel's measurements were close, but incomplete. He measured distance, not behavior. His system failed under real-world loading conditions. It was August 6, 2016, in Riverside County, California. Late afternoon heat filled a suburban duplex garage, where tools lined the walls and an exposed residential electrical panel faced a concrete floor. Kevin Morales was 29 years old and worked as a journeyman electrician. He had recently been laid off from a commercial contractor and was living in a suburban duplex, using the attached garage as a personal workspace. Online, he maintained a small social media page where he posted short electrical demonstrations, usually filmed alone. He often told followers that household electricity was overhyped if you truly understood it. Familiarity, he believed, made him safe. Most of Kevin's professional work involved de-energized systems handled under lockout and tagout procedures. He understood those rules, but chose not to follow them that day. Inside the garage, a standard 240-volt residential service panel was mounted on the wall. Kevin removed the dead front cover, exposing the copper bus bars. He attached a thick copper wire to one energized phase and left the opposite end bare. A general-purpose rubber floor mat was placed beneath him, assumed to provide insulation. The garage was hot, and sweat increased skin conductivity. A phone was positioned nearby to record the demonstration. In the video, Kevin stands on the mat facing the camera, gesturing toward the open panel and the exposed wire. He then turns the breaker on. The panel becomes energized. He shifts his weight forward and leans in. As his arm moves closer, the copper wire in his hand narrows the air gap between the live bus bar and his forearm. He never touches the metal. He does not need to. A bright white flash fills the frame. The electrical arc jumps instantly, superheating the air and creating a blast of heat and pressure. Kevin jerks backward, but the current has already bridged. The arc connects to his forearm and chest. The phone records him collapsing backward onto the concrete floor. His right arm locks rigid, and his body stiffens as electricity passes through him. Smoke begins to rise inside the garage. The current travels from his arm across his chest and exits through his legs, passing directly through the heart. There is no prolonged struggle. He does not attempt to stand. The phone continues recording. Light gray smoke spreads across the frame. The exposed panel remains energized. Kevin lies motionless on the floor, partially visible at the edge of the shot. No one else is present. The video runs without interruption. Neighbors later reported hearing a loud popping sound, followed by silence. Several minutes pass before someone enters the garage and finds Kevin on the floor. Emergency services are called. Paramedics arrive and disconnect the power before approaching him. Kevin is unresponsive. No pulse is detected. Brief resuscitation efforts are attempted but stopped almost immediately due to the severity of the injuries. He is pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as electrocution, causing immediate cardiac arrhythmia. Burns on Kevin's forearm marked the arc entry point, with exit burns on both feet, consistent with current passing through the chest. Investigators found no equipment malfunction. The wiring was correct, the mat was not rated for insulation, and the wire showed arc damage. The video captured the entire sequence without interruption. Investigators found no evidence of equipment malfunction. It was June 14, 2018, in Tampa, Florida. Late afternoon heat settled over a small apartment complex, where a narrow third-floor concrete balcony overlooked palm trees and a parking lot below. The structure had absorbed hours of direct sunlight and the air was still. Olivia Klein, 34, lived alone in one of the units and worked from home as a freelance graphic designer. She also maintained a small lifestyle blog focused on peaceful coexistence with urban wildlife. Olivia rejected pest control and extermination services, believing that animals posed little risk if humans adjusted their behavior. Friends and neighbors described her as calm, principled, and dismissive of conventional safety advice. Earlier that spring, Olivia noticed a paper wasp nest forming beneath her balcony railing and chose not to remove it. Over the following weeks, the nest expanded and wasp activity increased. She photographed the insects, left fruit and sugary drinks outside, and continued documenting their presence despite repeated warnings from neighbors and property management. On the afternoon of June 14th, Olivia stepped onto the balcony to water her plants. She positioned her phone near the sliding glass door, aimed outward toward the railing and the cluster of nests beneath it. In the recording, Olivia moves calmly across the balcony. She holds a watering can in one hand and gestures toward the plants. As she reaches closer to the railing, her forearm swings outward and strikes part of the nest cluster. The response is immediate. The video captures a sudden surge of movement as dozens of wasps erupt from beneath the railing. Olivia recoils and swats reflexively. Her movements become erratic as she turns toward the sliding door, while wasps swarm her face, neck, arms, and upper chest. She recoils sharply and stumbles backward. The phone continues recording as she fumbles with the door handle and drops the watering can. Wasps strike repeatedly, visible as fast-moving shapes crossing the frame. Neighbors later report hearing loud distress sounds and repeated impacts against the glass. Olivia manages to step partially inside before collapsing near the threshold. The sliding door remains partly open. Her movements weaken as the stings continue. After several seconds, the swarm begins to disperse once she stops moving, and the immediate threat ends. The recording shows Olivia lying motionless near the doorway, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her skin swells rapidly, especially around her face and neck. No one enters the apartment immediately. Several minutes later, neighbors force entry after hearing the commotion. By the time they reach her, the wasps have dispersed and emergency services are called. Paramedics arrive to find Olivia unresponsive. They count more than 70 distinct sting sites across her body. She is transported to a nearby hospital, where aggressive treatment is initiated. Despite intervention, her condition deteriorates rapidly. Olivia dies within an hour of the initial attack. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as systemic venom toxicity. She was not allergic. The sheer volume of venom caused organ failure and cardiovascular collapse. Investigators removed multiple nests using full protective gear and sealed the balcony. A review of her online activity showed warnings about cumulative venom exposure had been dismissed. Thank you for watching. Like this episode, click here for more videos.